Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where I discuss everything fantasy football. As always, I'm your host, Jeremiah, and we are back again with another action-packed show for you guys today. And I'm going to discuss the Super Bowl. I have to. It was just an historic game. And, we saw the biggest comeback in Super Bowl history. We saw the first overtime game in Super Bowl history. And of course, later on the show, I will talk about the fantasy impact of Kyle Shanahan and the new Atlanta Falcons offensive coordinator, Steve Sarkisian, who just got named to that position today as we speak. Remember, Steve Sarkisian was named the Alabama offensive coordinator after Lane Kiffin left for Florida Atlantic University. But I will discuss the fantasy impact for the Atlanta Falcons with those two guys. And I will probably discuss the fantasy impact of the 49ers, and I will discuss Colin Kaepernick and other quarterbacks that could be changing teams later this offseason. But first and foremost, I got to talk about the Super Bowl 51 game. I have to talk about it. We saw one of the greatest historic performances ever by a quarterback, and that's none other than Tom Brady, who broke Super Bowl records in passing yards and attempts and completions, which was amazing in itself. Atlanta was up 28-3 after the third quarter. After that, they couldn't find a way to score. Maybe that's alluded to the play calling of Kyle Shanahan. Maybe that's a play calling of maybe that's to the execution of the play calling or the lack thereof by the Falcons offense. But overall, from a fantasy perspective, Matt Ryan still had a very good game. When you look at it on paper, Matt Ryan had a good game. Like, when you look at this game, let's just look at the score, look at the stats without even looking at the game summary by quarter. Let's just say if this looks like it was a shootout, and it looks like that. It looks like that the Atlanta Falcons were controlling the game most of the time, and it looks like Tom Brady looks like he was throwing it all over the place. That wasn't the case. The Atlanta Falcons control the pace of this game in the beginning. And the one thing I'm really disappointed about this game is that the Falcons didn't even run the ball to hold on to the lead. Devontae Freeman finished the game with 11 carries, 75 yards, and a touchdown. And Tevin Coleman had 7 yards, 29 carries, and no touchdowns. So when you put those two guys' stats combined, that's 18 for 104 yards and a touchdown. That's 5.8 yards a carry. Devontae Freeman averaged 6.8 yards a carry. How do you not run the ball with Devontae Freeman there? Devontae Freeman should have had a better game. Could have had a real great game. He probably would have went off for more than 150 yards the way that he was running the ball. But overall, the Falcons really kind of blew it. They blew this game. And I think if they would have just played a little more, if they would have run the ball a little bit more in the second half with Devontae Freeman, I think they would have no doubt won this game. And, as for the Patriots, one of the best performances from this game from the Patriots is not from Tom Brady. It's from James White. he was a surprising starter. Deion Lewis wasn't the starter. LeGarrette Blount didn't start. James White was the feature back in this game. He broke his Super Bowl record for most receptions with 14. The most receiving yards from running back at 110. He had a touchdown. And then to top it all off, he had 2 rushing touchdowns. So he had a total of 3 touchdowns. A total of 130 yards. That is amazing. That is amazing to me. And, he had a total of 20 touches. And James White, I feel like he should have been the MVP at this game by the numbers that he had. Well, other top performances from this game, Julian Edelman had a great catch at the fourth quarter. He finished the game with 87 yards on 5 receptions. Danny Amendola had a great game, 78 yards and 1 touchdown. Malcolm Mitchell had a great second half, finishing with 70 yards and 6 touchdowns. Martellus Bennett also had a good game, 62 yards and 5 receptions. So for the Falcons, you got Julio Jones with 87 yards and 4 receptions. He made a great catch at the end of the fourth quarter. Taylor Gabriel, great game, 76 yards and 3 receptions. And this team was throwing the ball all over the field. They were carving up this defense early. And Devontae Freeman also had 46 yards receiving to go along with his 75 yards. So Devontae Freeman, great game. Great game. I honestly think he had the best game on the Falcons. I think James White had the best game on the Patriots. And heading to next year, I think, the Falcons are, I don't know if they're going to go into a timeshare now because, with Steve Sarkisian being named the new offensive coordinator for the Falcons, I think things will be changing. But as of now, I think Devontae Freeman is the running back to have for Atlanta. I truly do think so. He showed really great bursts. He was the true running back that the Falcons were using. He had more touches than Tevin Coleman. Heading to next year, I think he is the guy to own next year. And as for the Patriots, it's tough to speculate on who the running back is. We saw LeGarrette Blount with 18 touchdowns. He had 11 carries, but only mustered up 31 yards. James White, I don't even know if he's ever going to have that kind of game again, ever in his life. And, Chris Hogan, everyone thought Chris Hogan was going to have he thought he was going to have a good game. He was irrelevant. He only had like 57 yards receiving. And as always, I think Tom Brady, I think he's going to be a top 10 quarterback heading to next year again. I think he will. And as for Matt Ryan, he is the MVP of the league. He had his best year. And I do think he will be one of the top. I do think he will be one of the first quarterbacks taken in the draft because of the year alone. I know he's not going to have Kyle Shanahan, but I do think that he will have another great year. He still has Julio Jones. He still has 2 great running backs. Even though Mohamed Sanu didn't really do a whole lot, he only had 25 yards and 2 receptions in the Super Bowl, but he's still someone that you can trust, down the line. But overall, when I look at these two teams heading to next year, I think the Falcons have a lot of players that are going to be relevant in fantasy. I still think Matt Ryan is going to be a top quarterback. Tom Brady is going to be a top quarterback. I think Devontae Freeman is the guy to own. He gets yards. He gets at least 100 total yards. He did in this game. And Julio Jones is going to be probably the second receiver taken in drafts. But overall, I do like the Falcons heading to next year. I do like their players for fantasy. As for the Patriots, it's tough to speculate. It looks like Julian Edelman is going to be the guy again, and Tom Brady looks like he's not going to slow down. But, I haven't ranked any of these guys yet, but we will, soon when, the springtime comes around. I do think Tom Brady is going to be one of the top quarterbacks taken. I think Matt Ryan might actually be taken before him. But looking forward to next year, I do think I don't think anyone in the Falcons is going to slow down. Tom Brady's not slowing down, and I do think you guys should feel comfortable of drafting them on your team. Well, that does it for this segment. I'm going to take my first break, and I'm going to discuss Kyle Shanahan and Steve Sarkisian when I get back to Going to Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Well, speaking of the Atlanta Falcons, they officially named Steve Sarkisian as the offensive coordinator for the team. It was announced earlier today, and this comes after 49ers have named Kyle Shanahan the head coach of the team. And as you know, Kyle Shanahan was the offensive coordinator this past season. Well, when I look at the Atlanta Falcons offensive roster from a whole fantasy perspective, you got MVP Matt Ryan, All-Pro wide receiver Julio Jones. You got Pro Bowler Devontae Freeman. You also got Tevin Coleman, who's just as good. They scored 33.8 points a game. They scored the eighth most points ever in NFL history with 508. So Steve Sarkisian has big shoes to fill, and as a fantasy perspective, I do think it will affect Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, Devontae Freeman a little bit. And earlier in the show, I talked about how Devontae Freeman should have been running the ball to pretty much secure the win for the Atlanta Falcons. But when I look at this team going forward, it's tough to speculate who will be the running back going forward. They were in the timeshare, Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman. But I kind of feel like Devontae Freeman has more upside to be a featured back. I really do think so, that he can be a featured back in this league. And we saw the year that Devontae Freeman had in 2015. He was one of the top. He probably was the top scoring running back in all fantasy. But when you fast forward to 2016, his numbers weren't as impressive because he wasn't in timeshare. As for Tevin Coleman, I do think he's someone that he's still someone that's draftable. I just think Devontae Freeman is someone you have to take instead of Tevin Coleman, because I do think that Steve Sarkisian will feature Devontae Freeman a little bit more. But that's tough to speculate. It looks like we have to wait to see what Steve Sarkisian's offensive philosophy is. But honestly, if you want to draft Matt Ryan, you should not be worried about drafting Matt Ryan at all. I do think that Matt Ryan is someone that's going to be really good next year. Remember, he had 38 touchdowns. He only threw 7 interceptions. Probably the best year in his career. I think he's honestly entering the prime of his career. Even though the Falcons should have won that Super Bowl, I still think Matt Ryan is going to come back. I just don't. When I look at the Super Bowl losing teams, when Carolina, they struggled to begin the year. They didn't make the playoffs. I don't see that for Atlanta. I think this is a better team than Carolina came in the season with. I think this is going to be a better team. I can see them winning the NFC South again. I do think they'll be fine. And the NFC South is full of great fantasy players. You still got Drew Brees. You still got Cam Newton. I think he's going to make a comeback. Even Jameis Winston became fantasy relevant this year. So the NFC South is full of fantasy players this year. But when I look at this team and the impact left by Kyle Shanahan, Kyle Shanahan really got this team playing like an offensive juggernaut. I don't know if Steve Sarkisian can do the same thing, but I still think the fact that Sarkisian has a fully loaded offensive weapons to work with, Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, Devontae Freeman, I think they will do just fine. I actually think they will make Steve Sarkisian look better. But as for Kyle Shanahan, he was officially named the head coach for the 49ers. And I do think that this will have huge fantasy impact on the 49ers. I'm not going to say that the 49ers are going to be the top 5 offense in the league. No. I do think that they're going to put up better numbers than they have been in the past few years. As of right now, they don't actually have a quarterback. But who I think it bodes well for Carlos Hyde. When you look at Kyle Shanahan, he's worked with guys like Matt Schaub. He's worked with RG3, he turned around Matt Ryan's career. I think if you're looking for guys to draft from the 49ers next year, I would say I wouldn't be surprised to go for it. I do think he can be someone that can do really good things. But when looking forward to next year, Kyle Shanahan, I'm not going to say that he is going to, I'm not going to say he's going to turn this team around like right away. There is some talk about, the Niners bringing in Jay Cutler, maybe Jimmy Garoppolo, Kirk Cousins, which are all fine and dandy, but I just don't know if they can replicate what Kyle Shanahan has done. So this is what Kyle Shanahan has done by the numbers. He's had 2 4,000-yard passers. He had Matt Schaub, who he might bring with him to San Francisco, and Matt Ryan, who's done it twice. 3 1,000-yard rushers. Devontae Freeman twice, Alfred Morris twice, and Steve Slayton of the Texans. He's had 4 1,000-yard receivers. Pierre Garçon, Andre Johnson, Julio Jones, and Santana Moss. Yes, Santana Moss. So he has produced 6 top 10 offenses in 9 years. So there's talk about Kyle Shanahan bringing Matt Schaub with him when I think, he can be a stopgap quarterback for the 49ers. And if he does become the starter there, I'm not saying that Matt Schaub would be a fantasy commodity, but I would take in consideration that, Matt Schaub can have a really good year. So whoever becomes a quarterback for the 49ers, I think they're going to have a very solid fantasy football year. Jay Cutler, even though I don't think his days as a starting quarterback are over, I think he becomes the 49ers. I think Kyle Shanahan can turn him around. I do think Kirk Cousins would be a great get for Kyle Shanahan. This team does need a quarterback. And Jimmy Garoppolo, I think he'll be a great guy to work with to start his head coaching career. We've seen what Jimmy Garoppolo done with the Patriots, and I do think for Jimmy Garoppolo to be really successful, he needs to be in a consistent. I do think Kyle Shanahan is the guy to do it. But when overall, we look at his past, I do think this bodes well for Carlos Hyde's fantasy value. I do think Carlos Hyde will, if he stays healthy, I do think he can be a Pro Bowler under Kyle Shanahan. We've seen what he has done with Devontae Freeman. We've seen what he has done with Alfred Morris. Alfred Morris he had 1,000 yards rushing twice. So I do think Carlos Hyde, he's just as good as those guys. I just think if Carlos Hyde stays healthy, I think he can be a really great fantasy running back to end the year. And as for the quarterback, I do think, Matt Schaub, he has potential to be very solid if he replicates any type of success he had with Houston. I think if Jay Cutler, I think he's someone to kind of keep a radar on if he goes with the 49ers. And you have to play the wait and see game. I think Kirk Cousins, I think he's someone, if he goes to the 49ers, I think he's someone that you can practically draft in the later rounds and you can possibly get good value for him. And as for the quarterbacks on the roster now, Blaine Gabbert's not going to be there. and Colin Kaepernick will not be there at all. And I'm actually going to talk about Colin Kaepernick and his fantasy value for next year. And he decided to opt out of his contract with the 49ers. And I'm actually going to discuss possible teams that Colin Kaepernick could potentially go to. And I will discuss the fantasy value of Colin Kaepernick when I get back to Going to Meet Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, well, welcome back to the Going to Meet Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. I had a lot to discuss today. It mostly had to do with Atlanta. That's probably due to the Super Bowl. Kyle Shanahan going to the 49ers and the fantasy impact of the players on San Francisco. And, of course, I did talk about the fantasy impact for going towards 2017 with Steve Sarkisian being named the offensive coordinator and how that will impact the fantasy value of Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, and Devontae Freeman. But a player I do want to talk about, and the reason why for this, I do think it's relevant because of the team that, well, he's going to leave. Colin Kaepernick put together a pretty solid season. He had really good, solid games. You know, he was a top 5 quarterback from weeks 11 to the 15th. You know, that was partially I know he had probably the worst game ever for a quarterback to have. You know, he's 1-5 for 4 yards for Chicago Bears, but there was a report saying that Colin Kaepernick is going to opt out of his contract with the San Francisco 49ers. And I decided to look at the possible destinations for Colin Kaepernick and what it could possibly do for his fantasy value. So when I look at the teams, I look at Chicago, Denver, Houston, the Jets. I look at those teams. And I look at the Browns too. We could put the Browns in there. When I look at those teams, you know, they look like they need quarterbacks to potentially compete. Well, when I look at the Chicago Bears, you know, I do think he'll have a chance to be a starter because I don't see any way Jay Cutler comes back. But I do think he has a chance to be a starter. They do have a top 5 pick in the draft, but I don't think they're going to use it on the quarterback. And, you know, Matt Barkley produced pretty good numbers late last year. And I do think for him to be a starter, this is a perfect team to do it with. I don't know if he'll have the same fantasy impact because of the cold weather that the Bears play in. And we know Colin Kaepernick played his worst game ever in his career at Soldier Field in the snow. Remember, he went 1 for 5 for 4 attempts. So I do think he'll be a starter, but I just don't think his fantasy value would be very good in that regard. And when I look at another team, you know, you can look at the Jets. You know, the Jets, I do think they have really good pieces. This will probably a really good receiving duo that probably the best he will ever have. If he goes to the Jets, he will play with Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker. Quincy Enunwa had a great year. And if they can get a running back there, you know, he has 2 good running backs as well. You know, Matt Forte, Bilal Powell, who looked like he's about to be the starter next year for the Jets. He has very good offensive pieces around him to succeed. So I think for the best team that he can go on for fantasy value is the New York Jets. because that is the best team he would be around since the Niners Super Bowl year in 2011. He has really two good backs. I know Matt Forte's at the tail of his career, but Lil Powell, I think he's about to be just beginning his career. Brandon Marshall looks like he's still a top receiver in the game. Eric Decker still a great option in the passing game, and we've seen what Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker have done for fantasy owners when Ryan Fitzpatrick was the quarterback. And I think Colin Kaepernick is more talented than Ryan Fitzpatrick. He can make plays with his legs. He can throw it deep. I think he will have really good talent. I think he will have really good fantasy value if Colin Kaepernick goes to the New York Jets. And as for another team, I think that could really use Colin Kaepernick, but they probably won't. I do think they'll go with Tony Romo. It's the Houston Texans. We all know how Brock Osweiler is. We saw how Brock Osweiler impacted DeAndre Hopkins. Brock Osweiler actually made CJ Fedora was very relevant. But if Colin Kaepernick becomes the Houston Texans starting quarterback, they will get him very cheap. I do think they have a very good receiver there. Colin Kaepernick has the arm to throw it deep to DeAndre Hopkins. Will Fuller is someone that can stretch the field, so I do think that's another good weapon for Colin Kaepernick to throw to. And they do have Lamar Miller, who was a very good fantasy running back this year. So I do think Colin Kaepernick has a very good fantasy value if he goes to the Houston Texans because of the offense around him. And another team that I think he would do good in is the Denver Broncos. They got Trevor Siemian, they got Paxton Lynch, who they drafted last year in the first round. They have a really good defense. They have very good receivers. They got Emmanuel Sanders. They got Demaryius Thomas. They got a top 5 receiver duo if used properly. I do think that Colin Kaepernick could be very good with the Broncos. They have somewhat of a really good running game. I do think that Devontae Booker is going to have a great year. He did become a rookie. But I do think this is another team he can be very valuable at, for fantasy owners. I think he can have a very good year for the Broncos if he does indeed sign with them. But I don't know. I think Denver is very happy with Paxton Lynch and Trevor Siemian as the quarterbacks there. So I do think it's very unlikely he would be going there. And as for the last team, it's the Cleveland Browns. Hugh Jackson had a lot of interest coaching Colin Kaepernick a year ago. Colin Kaepernick had interest having Hugh Jackson as his head coach. But it looks like that the Browns are willing to trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. And if that does happen, it can possibly put an end to Colin Kaepernick to Cleveland talks. But if Colin Kaepernick does end up in Cleveland, I just don't see the fantasy value in that. He's going to have a team just as bad as he did in San Francisco. He does have more talent at receiver. He does have Corey Coleman. Josh Gordon might be back, and that's 2 talented receivers there. But it's just that I just feel like they will be playing from behind a lot. The defense is what I just don't think he will do really good there. It is Cleveland. He does have Isaiah Crowell. It can change. They can be more competitive, but I just don't think that he would have to be the reason why the team would be good. And I just don't think Colin Kaepernick is the type of guy to make a team good. I do think that for Colin Kaepernick to have very good fantasy value, he needs to be on a team with a very good defense. That's why I said, the Texans, I do think the Broncos, and I do think the Jets. Even though the Jets do have a pretty, bad defense, I think they have a very good receiver duo, and we saw what they have done with Ryan Fitzpatrick, So I think for, fantasy value, I'll have to go New York. I would have to go Denver. I would have to go Houston. Then I would have to go Chicago, and I would have to go with Cleveland. So I do think from the Jets to the Browns, the Jets is the best. The Browns are the worst. So from a fantasy perspective, that's my overall, that's my overall analysis on Colin Kaepernick opting out of his contract in San Francisco. And if somehow Colin Kaepernick doesn't find any interest in the free agent market, I can see him coming back to San Francisco, and I can actually see him thriving under Kyle Shanahan. And I think if he plays any way that he did last year times 2, I still think he can be very valuable for fantasy players out there. Well, that's going to do it for me today. And I will be back on Friday, and I think Andy should be back here too. But yeah, I thank you guys for tuning into the show. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms, on Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, and on the website gsmcpodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Twitter and on Instagram at @GSMC_football. And you can also like the show on Facebook at the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah. I will be back on Friday. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. You guys have a great day.